Good morning. Thank you all for coming to Policy Exchange today. As you know, we like to be at the heart of the great national debates here, and none more important in recent years than the subject of academic freedom, which is why we're delighted to be able to welcome the Higher Education Minister, Michelle Donelan, for this keynote address. As I say, we've made something of a splash and contribution to this subject in years gone by. Many of you will have read Academic Freedom in the UK by Eric Kaufman, Tom Simpson. At least half of that author team is here somewhere today. Eric, yes, you're here, and of course Ian Mansfield, once of this parish and now Department for Education, co-authored the most important paper, University at the Crossroads, which touched upon some of these issues as well. So, Minister, delighted to be able to welcome you, and I know it'll be hard to contain people in this discussion, and managing the question and answer session is a key part of that. And just to say to all of you, no question too outrageous. You just have to state your name and organisation first. So thank you, Minister. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody, and thank you, of course, for inviting me here to speak. We've gathered here today in support of freedom of speech, the absolute cornerstone of Western democracy. But supporting free speech is no longer enough, I would argue. Free speech is now something that has to be actively defended. It is a change of mindset for most of us who have grown up taking for granted how we would express ourselves freely. After all, Britain is home to free speech. Free speech is in fact the beating heart on which all freedoms do rest. And we are a country, a proud democracy, where we settle differences of opinion through honest and open debate and, of course, the ballot box. And we could not be more fitting to discuss this issue here at Policy Exchange, rightly, who pride themselves on their independent evidence-based research, whether that's, of course, on the pupil premium, on free schools, on the importance of history, or to our topic today, free speech and academic freedom. And I want to take a moment to thank you all for all that you've done to advance research, to promote new ideas, and to deliver a stronger society. And I would, of course, like to thank Lord Godson for his personal championing of this important issue. You have for many years raised alarm of the growing real threat that academic freedom in these institutions is being undermined and chipped away, which endangers our entire democracy. For hundreds of years, universities have been instrumental in promoting our traditions and, of course, our values. They have played a role in fostering debate, in sharing ideas, even if contentious, and they have advanced society in the process. Many of the fundamental ideas that helped to build today's society were once, in fact, considered controversial. Fringe ideas that only reached prominence through open debate on campuses up and down the country. Where would we be now if the views of 100 or even 200 years ago had never been challenged? As a woman, I doubt that I would be a member of Parliament, let alone the Minister for Higher and Further Education. But sadly, where once we found critical debate and arguments which were run on their merit, today we have seen an upsurge in physical threats and complete intolerance of opposing ideas. We witness examples of professors being harangued and hounded just for doing their jobs. We see prominent, well-respected guests no platformed. We find academics self-censored and self-censoring themselves. Progress is no longer considered progress unless it conforms to an increasingly narrow ideology. And let's be honest for a moment, successive governments have failed to put this right. There's been a lot of talk, in fact, a lot of warm words, but not really enough solid action. So I am here today to tell you that this government is different. We are putting pen to paper in legislative action to once and for all change the forces that shut down debate. We are standing up for free speech and the open exchange of ideas in our universities like never before. And I will make sure that each of our universities remains an absolute fortress of ideas, putting an end to the nonsense of cancel culture, by wielding the crucial majority that the British public gave us, and fulfilling the wishes for a more open, fairer, and freer Britain. But before I go into the specifics of the legislation, let me tell you why this is so important to me personally. Like many people who were the first in their family to go to university, for me, university was more than just about learning. It was an experience that gave me the confidence to go out into the world, knowing I had a world-class, high-quality education under my belt. And something I tend to ask myself now is, would I be able to say that if free speech was not an intrinsic element of our universities? Look at the list of the top 100 universities in the world. Overwhelmingly, the world's best universities are in countries that rank the highest in the Free Speech Index. In fact, the entire top 10 of this list are found in countries where free speech scores highly. It is absolutely no coincidence that what keeps the United Kingdom and also the United States so dominant in higher education is our commitment to academic freedom. Authoritarian countries limit their students to a narrow view of the world and teach their students what to think rather than how to think. And they pay a hefty price for this in the long run. So I just want you to consider, who would you rather employ? An inquisitive, critical, open-mind graduate? Or a self-contained cookie-cutter graduate who is afraid to be challenged or confront new ideas? The answer for me, and I'm sure for you, is quite obvious. But I do worry. I worry that if we allow ourselves to drift towards a more narrow definition of free speech, we in fact risk going down that same dark path as those other countries and compromising what makes our universities world-class. Imagine the harm to an aspiring young person if they grow up seeing their universities drop out or down the top rankings, or find themselves unable to conduct world-leading research because the funding is going to more open countries. And the damage that the erosion of free speech causes goes well beyond the classroom, of course. It hits our communities, where ingenuity and diversity of ideas have flowed throughout our country's history. It stifles creativity, where some of our greatest artists and our greatest composers have made their name challenging the accepted wisdoms of the day. The implications for our economy and our public life are absolutely catastrophic. So I find it completely deplorable that last year, balaclava-clad protesters forced a female academic, Kathleen Stock, to stay off campus under threats of physical violence. And nor was this an isolated event. Just a few weeks later, the Israeli ambassador was hounded by an intolerant mob outside an LSE event, facing threats and insults that no other foreign diplomat faces in the UK. So we're not talking about peaceful protest here, the right of which, of course, is sacrosanct. We are talking about threats, intimidation and harassment, the shutting down of free speech by violence and threats of violence. Activities which too often university leaderships turn a blind eye to and do not do enough to stop. Here at Policy Exchange, you know as well as anyone about this change in culture in our universities over recent years. In fact, Policy Exchange's own polling shows that a number of current and retired academics choose to self-censor. The survey found that 32% of those who identify as fairly right or right have refrained from airing views in teaching and research. And this is, of course, not a party political issue. Around 15% of those identifying were identifying as centre or left and have also been self-censoring. In addition, 200 academics reported last year that they were receiving death threats and abuse simply for expressing a view, and crucially, that they did not feel supported by their universities. The intolerant few have decided that protecting people from offence is more important than advancing human knowledge. They have decided that violence is justifiable response to words, and ultimately they have decided that their freedoms are more important than the freedoms of those sitting across from them. It is sadly ironic that humanity has never had greater access to diverse ranges of opinions than we do today. Yet, we have to take action against people trying to limit that diversity. So let me take a moment to inform the intolerant few that their brief period of power is in fact over, because I have no hesitation in saying that diversity of opinion is just as important as diversity of background. The freedom to disagree is just as important as the freedom to agree. And democracy does not end at the gates of your echo chamber. As a government, we have taken unprecedented steps to protect student welfare. Whether that's stamping out sexual harassment and anti-Semitism, by tackling poor mental health provision and supporting the most disadvantaged through opportunities. We believe that exposing students to robust exchanges of views, though, does not harm their welfare. It helps make them into stronger, more confident and engaged citizens with curiosity and intellectual drive. It gives them the education that I benefited from when I went to university. So as I started with today, we have a long tradition of free speech in this country, and legal protections are already in place. But the evidence shows that these protections are not strong enough. There is no effective means of enforcement. We need to enhance and extend them as one part of our mission to change the wider culture. And attempts to erode free speech need to be challenged head on, which is what the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill will in fact do. Yesterday, a motion was passed to enable this to be carried over into the next session of Parliament, a restatement of this government's intention to legislate on this hugely important issue, fulfilling, of course, our manifesto pledge to the British public. This bill will put a duty on universities to promote free speech and academic freedom, not just protect it. It will put a duty on student unions to protect free speech, and it will establish a director for freedom of speech and academic freedom on the Office for Students Board, with the power to actually fine universities, colleges and student unions, and recommend real redress for those who have their speech unlawfully restricted. And it will provide a new legal tort as a critical backstop, offering a direct route to redress for individuals who have suffered loss due to a breach of their freedom of speech duties. It is a bill that is already being improved and honed by free speech its very self in Parliament as we speak. And from ensuring a wider definition of academic freedom to being explicit that constituent colleges of higher education providers are bound by it, this is going to be a bill that the rest of the world will take note of. Our friends in the House of Lords know firsthand how important free speech is, and I know that they will have a lot to say on this subject, and I look forward to hearing those views and the expertise that they will bring. But let's not kid ourselves. This is not just about what happens in Parliament, or in fact what happens in a lecture hall. We need to effect a culture change that will reverberate through the sector, from the student union bar right up to the Vice-Chancellor's office. And let me be clear, this is not an issue for Vice-Chancellors to shy away from. Frankly, this is not an issue that they will be allowed to shy away from. And many are joining us on this path to progress. I would, of course, like to thank Universities UK for the way that they have constructively worked with us to bring together Vice-Chancellors to share their insight with us. And in March this year, Professor Anthony Long, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost of the University of Durham, rejected calls by students to dismiss an academic who made clear that everyone is welcome on their campus. And at Cambridge University, a grassroots campaign led by staff led to the rejection of an attempt to impose a restrictive speech code on the university and instead upheld our country's proud tradition on free speech. So, Vice-Chancellors, university staff and students should not be on the wrong side of history here. I say to them, do not allow the history books to record your name as part of the small cabal of the intolerant. Look ahead and be part of a freer, fairer and more tolerant future. Because we have to go further. The high-profile cancellations and dismissals are just the tip of the iceberg in a broader culture of self-censorship. Now, more than ever, it is imperative that we ensure our universities are free from dogma and undue influence from states that wish to curb our freedoms. The war in the Ukraine is a conflict between democracy and autocracy. It is a result of a criminal, barbaric invasion of a sovereign country by one ruled tyrannically. It is a reminder to all of us of the ancient liberties that in Britain we hold dear and that underpin our freedom. In the Commons, the opposition to this bill has been fractured and incoherent. They have veered from saying it's unnecessary and bureaucratic in one breath to claiming that the next step, that it doesn't go far enough. Others have also tried to attack the idea of free speech itself, pointing out to the most extreme examples of its misuse. So let me be clear. There is absolutely nothing in this legislation which will give anyone the right to harass, the right to intimidate or abuse or promote violence or terrorism. And I am grateful to the sector as a whole for having been supportive of this issue as we brought it forward, because getting this right has a direct impact on many of the issues that this government does want to address. Freedom of expression is absolutely integral to our proposals for the reform of the Human Rights Act, a strong British tradition that we are determined to uphold in our laws. We committed to legislating to prevent public bodies shutting down freedoms through politically motivated boycotts and sanctions. The Deputy Prime Minister, Justice Secretary Dominic Raab, has already outlined plans that will protect against free speech being whittled away by what he rightly calls wokery and political correctness. These are important issues that the public have entrusted the government to tackle. So I'm sure that you will share my frustration that when there are so many real problems to address, from abuse on campus, from the use of NDAs to silence victims of sexual harassment and bullying, to poor quality outcomes, that what we then hear about is reports of staff time going into trigger warnings on Harry Potter and 1984, or earnest working groups discussing whether to cancel historical figures such as Isaac Newton, Francis Drake, or William Gladstone. Instead of silencing the views of those who we disagree with, I go back to my view that each university should be a marketplace of ideas, a place where we assess arguments on their merits, not on their popularity, a place where it is not just safe to debate, but where students and academics are actively encouraged to do so, a place where we advance our society by challenging ourselves with our views, and ultimately, a place where we live by the very words of Evelyn Beatrice Hall, namely, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. So I am confident that this bill does strike the right balance, that it is both proportionate and, of course, a necessary step to tackle the emerging culture that will otherwise threaten our higher education system and, in fact, hold people back. Like the British public, I believe that students and lecturers should not be silenced. And this isn't about the right, and it isn't about the left. This is about people who suffer when free speech is restricted and who are without those powers necessary to change that. Often, the poorest, the most disadvantaged minority groups. History tells us that whatever the short-term gains can be found from suppressing free speech, that they don't, in fact, last. To quote Frederick Douglass, he called free speech the great moral renovator of society and government, and of all rights, the dead of tyrants is the right which they first of all strike down, which is why this government is one that is prepared to stand up for free speech, and why I remain committed to this bill, and I am looking forward to its return in the Commons next session and its passage through the Lords. Thank you.
I'm sure many questions, as I say, just usual rule, please state your name and organisation first. Who do I see? Gentleman there, just state your name and organisation. Sorry, well, we've got a microphone for you so you can boom.
Okay, yes, I'm not sure if that's on. Okay. Professor Eric Kaufman, Birkbeck College. Really, thank you for the speech. I couldn't agree more with what you said. I have a question, though, about the role of VCs. So we know that a lot of what's happening is the moralization of debate is occurring, and particularly amongst a small group of quite radical actors who can then lead some of these campaigns of harassment of academic staff. I mean, what should be the role of VCs in situations where particular academics are being harassed online and within the university?
Yep, thank you. Well, this is why the legislation is different. It is about adding teeth to our current legislation and ensuring that we're promoting a culture of free speech. And that only happens when Vice-Chancellors stand up for their own academic staff. They go into bat for them, they defend them, and they ensure that there is that culture on their campus where a lecturer feels confident to air their views, to challenge the status quo. And that's why we need Vice-Chancellors to actually put their money where their mouth is, come forward, be proactive, and defend their staff on this. Otherwise, we are just going to constantly bow in to the intolerant view.
Good. Who else? I see quite a gentleman there. Yes, please, name and organisation.
Thank you. Arif Ahmed, University of Cambridge. Thank you very much, Minister, for an excellent speech. I wanted to ask about censorship by student unions. You'll be aware of, and I'm aware of cases where student unions have, for instance, either tried to expel individuals or prevented access to freshers' fares for societies that are speaking lawfully, but presenting views that the student unions disagree with. Is it your intention to fine these bodies or otherwise to control this activity?
Yes, absolutely. So student unions will be covered by the bill. We are ensuring that no stone is left unturned and there isn't a giant loophole. So absolutely, they will be covered within this bill and they will face fines and sanctions.
Lady there, towards name and organisation, please.
Thank you. Naomi Waltham-Smith, University of Warwick. Thank you very much for reiterating that you would like to give teeth to the protection of freedom of speech and academic freedom on campuses. Given the high cost of entry to the High Court and also that the new OFS director won't be able to issue binding judgments, will the government consider introducing a right to bring a claim in the employment tribunal in addition to the statutory tort? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the first route and the primary route that will be open to both students, visiting speakers and academics will, of course, be the free route via the director. And then we did think it was right to create a legal backstop in the form of the statutory tort for individuals to then take their issues through the courts. We are not considering what you said about employment tribunals. We believe that this legislation will add the teeth that is necessary and also change behaviour on our campuses. Universities won't just have to protect free speech, they will have to promote it. This is about changing the culture. This is about stamping out the cancel culture that has become, that has sadly been allowed to grow across our campuses over recent years.
Lady there was, I think, a question, just if we get the microphone over. Name and organisation, please.
Helen Joyce, of The Economist until a few weeks ago and now at Sex Matters. First, thank you so much for standing up for Kathleen. Every woman who's been harassed on campus or anywhere else saw what happened to her, and I know her well, so I know behind the scenes how that felt for her. Every woman who watched that saw you speak and others in the government speak, and that really helped. I guess the problem is that it's not just about negative rights, is it? It's about positive rights. So Kathleen now runs a Substack, and in it she said yesterday that she wouldn't go back to being an academic. She got 28,000 views on her most recent Substack, and she was able to speak more freely. She feels that academia is no longer a place where people can speak freely and do good work, that the interesting things that are happening are outside it. And it seems to me the rot has gone so far inside academia that really people are censoring themselves. It's the censor up here. We don't even need the mobs threatening people on campus. People aren't even allowing themselves to think original thoughts. What can you do about that?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head in terms of self-censorship. That is the key issue here. That is why we are trying to ensure that we change the culture on our campuses, that we reinforce this idea that diversity of opinion and diversity of beliefs is just as important as diversity of background. And that is something that this legislation will deliver. by having that teeth. If we are honest, the current legislation is not enforceable on this very topic. So it's no wonder that why this issue has been allowed to grow over the years. And it is a very, very sad case in relation to Kathleen and the countless others like her that have turned away from academia and now won't be adding those additional thoughts and challenges to research and subject matters. And it's something that this government, I myself as a minister, am determined to change the tide on.
Brilliant. Gentleman there on the far side, been waiting patiently. Their name and organisation.
Mark Glendenning, Institute of Economic Affairs. Minister, you spoke rightly about the need to bring about a culture change on this issue. But how is this government going to achieve that when at one and the same time it's introducing the online safety bill, which will give the police and the CPS the right to prosecute people for causing serious psychological harm, so entrenching in British law the new left's conception of what is safety. This seems to me a fundamental contradiction, and how would you defend that?
Well, I think that the online safety bill is fundamentally designed to protect children using the internet, and I don't think that we should be ashamed of that fact. As a constituent CMP, of meeting thousands of hundreds of parents on a regular basis, meeting many school children, I see the opportunities, but also the dangers that the internet can provide. And so a responsible government does have to tackle that issue. And so I think that the two are not in challenge with one another. As I said a moment ago, what this bill is doing, what our agenda is doing, is really trying to hammer home the point and the enforcement mechanisms needed to ensure that diversity of opinion is just as important as diversity of background.
I see several people online wanting to come in. I see Shireen Benjamin, Senior Lecturer, University of Edinburgh. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, if you just speak a tiny bit louder so everyone in the room can hear you.
I'll do my best. Can you hear me now?
Loud and clear.
Excellent. First of all, Shireen Benjamin, University of Edinburgh. First of all, I really want to echo what Helen Joyce said. There's a lot of academic self-censoring in universities, in mine and others. My question relates to possible perverse effects that might be associated with what I understand the bill is setting out in terms of penalising universities or student unions who cancel speakers or who allow defamatory protests against speakers. And my concern there is that might have the perverse effect of making university managers less likely to allow those speakers to be invited in the first place. There are already lots of barriers, lots of challenges that you face as an academic if you want to invite supposedly controversial speakers onto campus. And I'm worried that it might get even harder if risk-averse managers are then fearful about incurring financial penalties. So I'm wondering how the bill will address that.
Yeah, so there's a good point and one that I've heard before, and there's several ways, in fact. By setting up a new office with the director, we will have somebody who is going to be issuing comprehensive guidance to support universities when making these decisions, which they don't have at the moment. So they can be much more risk averse because they don't know where the line is. The legislation is obviously much more explicit. And let's not forget that they will have a duty to promote free speech. If they batten down their hatches and then suddenly stop inviting anybody, that is certainly not promoting free speech and something that the director can in fact pick them up on and fine them for. So I am confident that will not become a reality. And I've said so on the floor of the House, and I will continue to do so, because this legislation is about improving the current situation and making sure that our campuses are hubs of free thought and ideas, just as I said throughout my speech.
I see quite a lot of other questions. I'm just trying to get a flavour. Someone at the back there with a pen, I think, being held up. Name and organisation, please.
Thank you. It's Harry Anderson from Universities UK. Thanks for the comments regarding our constructive engagement on the bill too. My question is about academic freedom, we've heard you talk a lot about freedom of speech, but whether you have any views on the sort of concern that the bill could narrow academic freedom, given it specifies it within the field of expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. This is something that we discussed at length at committee stage, and as a government we committed to taking away and considering, and we will be coming back to the House at report stage on this matter. That's all I can say on this at the moment, but I have been in listening mode. This is about producing a workable piece of legislation that will deliver on all of the problems that we have discussed today.
Thank you. Gentleman there in the aisle. Name and organisation, please.
Hi, it's Will Hazel from the I newspaper. Minister, do you have any candidates in mind for the free speech champion at the OFS?
Well, we certainly wouldn't want to preempt the process, which will be a robust and proper one, and we will follow that properly.
Brilliant. Who else do I see? Question. Gentleman there.
Ewan Somerville from The Telegraph. I just wondered whether, what you think the impact of the COVID pandemic has been sort of on free speech in universities, because it does seem like a lot of the worst incidents have sort of happened during the pandemic. And specifically, I wondered whether you think that sort of online learning and the, we know that that's continuing in a lot of universities. I wondered whether you think that's actually harming free speech in a way, because we see lots of reports of students sort of not speaking during seminars when they're on Zoom, sort of preferring to turn their cameras off, stay in silence, and obviously the impact in in-person seminars when there's masks over their faces. We see this sort of silencing going on there. So I wonder whether you think, first of all, it's got worse during the pandemic in terms of silencing, and second of all, whether the continued persistence of online learning is harming free speech as well.
So I think in general, the pandemic has highlighted to all of us just the importance of freedoms now more than ever. And I believe that there have been a catalogue of very public and profile instances of both freedom of speech and academic freedom in our campuses over the last few years. This is a growing issue. In terms of face-to-face teaching, the majority of universities are now back to pre-pandemic ways of teaching. However, there is a stubborn minority who are not, and they are letting students down by resisting going back to pre-pandemic ways of teaching. We all know the value of that face-to-face interaction, just like many of us are doing here today, the way that you can feed off one another's views and ideas. And let's not forget, university is a massive investment of time and money, and I think that students deserve a fair deal. They shouldn't be on a second track to the rest of society, should they? Let's remember, students and lecturers, most of them will be going to the pub, they'll be going to birthday parties, weddings, going out for meals, going to enjoy the rest of the freedoms that this government has now unlocked. So why should they have to be learning their lectures online and paying for the privilege of doing so? So I am determined to ensure that the stubborn minority get back to pre-pandemic ways of teaching.
Thanks so much. One more question. I'm sorry to disappoint anyone. Dennis Hayes, Professor of Education, University of Derby. Dennis Hayes, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
If you would just speak a little louder, please.
Yes, I can. Fine.
We hear you. Please, go ahead.
Good. At Academics for Academic Freedom, we have been defending academics' right to free speech and academic freedom for nearly 2 decades. And it's a very difficult task against those who would cry offence at whatever is said. But one concern we have about the new bill, or act to be, is that it will not create a battle of ideas in the academy, but rather lawfare, where people will be going to take grievances out. And in fact, could possibly, and from our experience, taking out cases takes up endless amounts of time, that people will be more passive as a result of what you're suggesting, and we will just be taken up in endless bureaucratic procedures. And that is perhaps my biggest worry about the Act, although I have to say I do recognise and support the government's recognition that there is a free speech issue in universities.
There is an issue, as you pointed out, and as I'm sure everybody in this room recognises, and unless we have legislation that has teeth, that has enforcement abilities, we will never be able to tackle it. That is the reality. That is why it is growing as an issue on our campuses. That's why so many students have come to me and so many lecturers have come to me and presented this issue. That's why we put it in our manifesto, and that's why we are delivering. This bill does have that enforcement mechanism. It does have that one-stop shop, which will be the first port of call in the form of the director, not going to courts. That will be a secondary backstop. So we have to tackle this issue head on. Warm words and gentle prodding hasn't worked so far. So that's why we need legislative action.
Thank you, and my apologies to the large number of people who've been disappointed today, but this will be not our last intervention on the matter, so my, as I say, renewed regret to all of you who haven't had a chance to answer questions. Just remains to thank you, Minister, for coming here. You all